Hello and welcome back to Nest of Fearties. My name is Coll McCail, I edit Scotia, and today is Tuesday the 12th of May. I'm joined by Francis Curran, former member of the Scottish Parliament for the SSP and a college lecturer and trade unionist. Francis, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm also joined by Sean Baillie, who's an activist and organiser from Glasgow. Sean, how are things?
Great, yep, thank you.
Scottish election is over and the results are in. Let's start by having a bit of a chat about those results. Francis, what did you make of the result? The SNP came in as the largest party, albeit on a diminished vote share across the board, a diminished constituency vote in all but 2 seats across the country. What did you make of the Scottish National Party's performance?
If I was the SNP leadership or their activist base, I'd be quite chuffed actually, given they've been in for the amount of time that they've been in, and there's not really delivered anything for anybody of a substantial note. So the fact that they're still there and they're still the majority party by a long way, I think tells you something about Scotland and consciousness and the national question, and the fact that there's no going back to UK politics in Scotland. It's just not going to happen. And I think a lot of the headlines have been the breakthrough for reform. It's been massive, but I don't actually see it in that same way. I think if you look at it, there's like a 2/3 majority that's progressive in the Scottish Parliament between the SNP and the Greens, and I think that is a really positive sign for the Scottish Parliament for the next 5 years. Do I think the SNP will have an internal reflection of it? Do I think they'll think we need to change direction? Do I think they will take the view that they need to really punt an independence referendum? No, actually. I think the lacklustre campaign, the lack of engagement, probably from a load of their activists as well, in fact all the party's activists, probably with the exception of the Greens, as an indication that they should just keep going as they're going. Steady goes the ship. So I don't see that much changing actually. If I was the SNP, I'd be pleased given the situation they were in.
Sean, Francis mentions that progressive majority within the Parliament. That's caveated by, as she says, the breakthrough of reform, 17 MSPs, an MSP in every region of the country. What did you make of their performance?
Reforms? It's really hard to say. I don't think they did as well as what they thought they would. I don't think they did as well as everybody's making out they did. But it is a huge marker in the politics of Scotland that there's now representation of that sort in Holyrood. And I'll be interested to see where that goes. I feel they're still undefined as to who they're really representing or the programme that they want to represent, but I think what they are doing, or what they do epitomise, is actually a fight between the interests of capital and the interests of the Scottish state, which is the first time we've ever seen that capital reacting in a political form of political representation so explicitly with the state. And I'll be interested to see how that plays out over the next 5 years.
Unpack what you mean by that, a fight between capital and the Scottish state.
So I think there's a number of things happening at the minute. You've got people like Sir Tom Hunter and Willie Hawley have got their podcast, and they are regularly bringing on hosts of businessmen and business people to talk about how the tax system in Scotland is deeply unfair to small businesses, it's crippling the economy. Malcolm Offord was very much hanging this hat on. We need growth and investment. We need to take the shackles off the Scottish economy to make it more prosperous, and then Scotland will flourish. I think that was a Tom Hunter line recently, but Scotland will flourish if we make it a tax haven, and this regressive SNP tax system is holding the country back during a time of cost of living, and the answer is that we've become this wild free market state. And actually, I think certain forces have co-aligned behind reform to help push that, and it's mainly shown by the amount of funding they've got and the access, and their campaign has been funded by interests who feel that as well. Whereas in the past we've had different political representation for different projects. I do feel this is the first time that Scottish capital or capital figure across the UK is now pushing back definitely against the Scottish state in particular.
Why do you think, Francis, if that is the case and there is this capital, this weight of capital behind reform, they're picking up so many votes in places like the East End of Glasgow where they beat Labour into third place on the constituency ballot?
I think, is it Hope Not Hate, produced a report about reforms. Might not be Hope Not Hate, I can't remember who it was. But they produced quite a detailed report on who's voting reform. And it's like 30% working class people from the most deprived areas, 30% better off, but who are just anti-immigration's their issue. But for the working class voters, it's cost of living issues, it's economic issues. There's 30% who were into climate change, or were against the boats, and then there was another 10%. And they made the point, which I think is interesting, if you put all the reform voters in the one room, they'd all be fighting with each other. And I think what they've been able to do so far is hold a coalition together. And the question is, are they going to be able to do that? Now, I've got no illusions. I think that if you look at what's happened with the right in Europe and in the US, then they're going to use the most vile racism and attempts to split working class people who are living in communities that are deprived, or just working class people in general. And the return of the boats is what you hear now. It's a narrative that's now coming out. You hear it in the street, you hear it in college where I teach. You hear it everywhere, and they've won that narrative. But they now need to go further than that. And I think Offord made a huge mistake. These comments about, I'm a self-made man, Mr. Entrepreneur, this is how rich I am. It doesn't play in Scotland. It just doesn't play this, isn't it, the US? And if they try to dismantle they're not going to have the power to dismantle, but if they try to go after public sector workers, which are a big section of the working class in Scotland, then I think they are going to run into all sorts of difficulties. Even with the populism that they're going to put out, reform of the NHS. I mean, if they touch the NHS in Scotland, or they attempt to put the case for touching the NHS in Scotland, I think they're going to be surprised. I don't think they can read Scotland. I think Farage can read England, but I don't think they've got people in Scotland, including Offord, who can actually read Scotland, and it's a different political terrain for them. So let's see the vile that they come out with, or they may tone it down a bit actually to try and become respectable politicians. I also think there'll be a few scandals in the pipeline, which I'll sit back and watch with relish, I have to say, because these people are just grifters.
Who do you think they think they're talking to, Sean, when they talk to their vision of the working class and of the left behind? Who are they speaking to in their heads?
I think they're quite explicit in who they're speaking to. So the reason I say it's the interest of the capital is even when they discuss things that they promote messages about immigration, boats, housing, access to public services, the decline of public services, they're speaking to predominantly working class voters, but as though just tracking the book. You know what I mean? The reason they're speaking about these things is because the alternative directly challenges with the people who are bankrolling reform, their relation to capital. So rather than reform the housing system, rather than reform immigration, rather than reform the economy and protect public services, all the things that would make it less profitable for them, which has been maybe happening slowly, and we would argue for more, they're now pushing back by throwing this very divisive message. He said, don't look at us, don't try and build more council houses, or we'll have more controls in the private rented market because it's making us so much money. The issue is that there's too many people coming to the country, rather than the housing system is totally broken. So I think they're quite clear on who they're messaging, and the reason to do that is to do two things. It's to build their own base, but it's also to divide the base of their opposition. And it's all of that is acting in their self-interest. There will be contradictions that come out of that, and how that is represented, and even some of the candidates might be, I think, are getting taken for a bit of a ride, I mean, the voters. So it will be interesting, as Francis says, to see how that's going to play out over the next couple of years in Parliament.
As I say, I don't mean to be complacent at all, because I don't think we've had the right-wing discourse in Scottish politics before that we're now going to see. And of course, the BBC, the mainstream media, and also social media will be carried. We're going to see a saturation of that, I would think, in the next years that we're here. But when you look at the actual voting, though, it's a straightforward swap with the Tory seats. Their seats have gone down and Reform have taken their seats. And so I think for us, maybe the question is, it looks like, if you look at the SNP, it looks like the centre held. You've got the Greens on one side, which who are radical but not working class radical, and you've got reform on the other side who are to the right of the Tories. And so the interesting question from a left-wing perspective is that polarisation going to be borne out, and what's it going to look like in terms of working class communities, working class jobs, working class elections, electoral results. And I think that's what we're going to have to contend with, or not contend with, understand how that's going to pan out. There'll be a reaction to reform.
Do you think there will be?
I do.
What form do you think it will take?
I do. You might not see it in an organised form, but I think there'll be people thinking this is not, for Glasgow, for example, the Glasgow of Mandela, the Glasgow Red Clydeside, the Glasgow UCS, the Glasgow the anti-poll tax campaign, the Glasgow fighting Thatcher. I just don't see how people are not going to respond to reform and what they're saying in that parliament. And I think it will bring people together. It may be local campaigns, it may be ad hoc campaigns. It will bring into focus the need for an organisation, and maybe individuals who come to the fore, who take them on. But there'll definitely be a reaction. I don't think you can... It's interesting, actually, when you look at the vote, because in West and in the regional list and in Central, Central's got places like Motherwell and Wishaw and Airdrie and Coatbridge, and the West has got areas that a million years ago I used to represent, like Inverclyde. They've got the highest levels of deprivation. Now, Reform took 58,000 votes, and we're right behind the SNP in both of them. In Glasgow, the SNP, I think, took 60. The Greens took 58,000, Labour took 47,000, and Reform took 38,000. And so there's a big difference there in the list vote in terms of the outlook and the consciousness in Glasgow. Now, the other side of that is, I think in Easterhouse they took about an 18-20% swing, and in Shettleston, the one that's always considered, is always head up for the worst deprivation and the worst turnout, they took a 24% swing. So you can see in concentrated areas they may be able to get away with that. But I'm not sure in Scotland's biggest city whether they're going to be able to carry that through. I think they're going to meet a lot of opposition and a lot of resistance. And I think the regional list vote is an indication of that.
I think that's true to an extent, right? But I think it's also true that while there was this sizable Tory vote which diminished and went to Reform, Ailsa Henderson on the BBC's election coverage pointed out that about 15% of Reform's list vote was people who hadn't voted in 2021. 12% of it came from the SNP voters on the list in 21, and 11% from Labour on the list in 21. So there is this transition and then pulling away from other parties. Sean, do you think there will be a reaction to Reform's election in Glasgow and places that have a progressive story, as Francis was saying?
I think there already has been a reaction of sorts. I think it's sharpened the minds of a lot of people. I think there is existing coalitions or organisations who have been doing a lot of good work for a long time, building up organisations of self-defence or campaigned against racism in general, and there's been campaigns and marches in the city in the lead up to the election, and even after the election there was very much a statement of intent by people in the city to march against a lot of the overt messages from Reform. But it's whether that reaction is going to be to the same size or bigger than the reaction Reform are going to get from the political establishment or the political centre. And as we see that when Swinney straight off the bat, and rightly or wrongly, he said we're going to talk to every part for Reform. That has just fed Thomas Kerr his next 2 weeks media lines, and he'd be able to go back out and say, look, we're railing against the establishment, we're the insurgency, Scotland's stagnated and we're here to shake things up. His tweet was about being a fox in the hen house or something. Like, he's dying to play that anti-establishment role whilst actually playing the role of the establishment. And I think the need for reaction against Reform needs to come in other ways, or ways that are a bit more, I don't know, we need to take them on in a way that, one, builds our base again and builds our, but also is that anti-establishment way. It needs to be a bit cheeky, I think. It needs to be a bit witty. It needs to take them on not from a position of moral superiority either. It needs to be a wee bit grittier, if that makes sense. And that's not going to be the position or the role of the centre, the centre left, or the existing left forces. There needs to be just something else that's thrown in the mix that kind of takes the knees a bit out from underneath them a wee bit and dents their confidence, or dents that they're carving out a position in the Parliament of being the radical voices in a way and being the outspoken ones, and there needs to be something that mirrors that or can combat that at a very base level, and it might seem a bit reductive and it might seem not everybody's cup of tea, particularly in Scotland, where in recent years it's been very much rise above it. Maybe somebody needs to play a wee bit dirty about.
How useful are the stories that you just mentioned, you know, the city of Nelson Mandela, the city of UCS, the city of the anti-poll tax? How useful are those stories, and is that narrative now telling those stories in a city which has just had such a sizable reform vote? Is there a need, in light of this result, to sort of retell that national story a bit? Francis?
I think Sean's right. I think that the only answer to taking on reform is a radical alternative. And I can understand why people would vote reform, or why they buy the line of reform if you're living in one of these communities, if you're a different party, and it's a working class community. Because nothing's changed just about since the Scottish Parliament's been implemented. There's been no redistribution of wealth. In fact, since the banking crash, it's got worse. And I know people laugh at me, right, but I need to mention my close. Right, so I've lived there 25 years nearly, and my close has not been painted in that time, right? And it's a state, there's 2 attempts to burn it, the back close. The paint is hanging off at the bottom. It's a total embarrassment when people come to visit you. I'm embarrassed by it. And we've been fighting with the Housing Association. I'll not say who it is, I'll just say, but anyway, who it is. And they just keep getting blanked on it. And that matters to me. And there's none of the candidates that's going to get my close painted. And for people who are living in an area that just becomes more neglected and more run down, and these people come along and they say, see this lot, the establishment, they're on it for themselves, and they do nothing for you. We're going to break that system, the system that screws you. I can understand that, and I can also understand it from the point of view of young working class men. And I mean, I see it in the street, I see it in the college, I see it amongst young men in general. That's why people like Sean's quite important, although I don't know how young he is these days. But I think it's important because the left needs a bit of reflection here, both about the fight it puts up and the character of that fight, and about how it talks to working class people. Because I'm concerned for young working class men of all races. Because you'll get misogyny, you'll get racism, but you'll also get vulnerability, and you'll get anxiety, and you'll get all these other things. And the question is, and the outcomes for them in society are just, they've got no future. The insecurity is palpable, especially with AI and all that coming in jobs, like in the hospitality and call centres and all these places that section of our community would be employed. And I think that sometimes the left is way too judgmental and also doesn't speak the language. And I think that is what we have to get over if we want to actually build a left. The thing about the Scottish Socialist Party, and before it Scottish Militant Labour, is we knew how to organise, we were radical, and we got 130,000 votes in that 2003 election, the one that I got elected in. And they were in the working class areas. And I think that's, if we're going to start somewhere, that's the lessons that we have to learn. And it was both parliamentary, but it was extra parliamentary as well for working class communities. They would have got my clothes painted, but that's not happened. And that's what people are pissed off about. It's what they're angry about. They feel the decline. It's almost kind of, it's visceral. Every morning you get to your work and there's the pavements are wrecked, there's rubbish. You have to get your clothes. Except transport, it's just an absolute shambles. And so when that's all engulfing and nobody's providing an alternative, here's these shining new people on the street. And also they speak to the manosphere, as we've started calling it, but that idea of appealing to working class young men from the point of view of giving them an identity and telling them that this is the alternative. Although it'd be interesting to see how they're going to play the national question, because that might work in England and it's working in Wales to an extent, but how's that going to work in Scotland? Because the majority of those communities support independence.
I think, to go back to the point around how relevant or how important is the history, I think I will always say that working class history is hugely important. Massive self-interest in that as well, and it's where I've done a lot of political inspiration from. But those traditions do or can breed a sense of collective identity that I think is missing. So it's maybe the stopgap in having those traditions or the retelling of those traditions has bred that kind of an alienation within white working class men that they don't feel they've got a political home apart from in these organisations that are a reaction to how society's changing elsewhere. But there's other things in there around society has changed, and it was deliberately changed. I think we need to look at why and how it was deliberately changed. And there was a direct attack on the organisations of working class people, both in their employment, but how they socially organised, how they organised economically. And within that, there was attacks from outside the class on key particular areas, like the construction unions being smashed and blacklisted, and that was all a political ploy, or definitely had further political ramifications if it wasn't an explicit thing at the time. That's led to that feeling of alienation ongoing. But even as that continued, how that industry's been evolved or changed over time is that those industries are less collective by design now as well. So when we talk about deindustrialised areas, I think what we're not talking about is the class composition or the relation to capital within those. So although they're deindustrialised, how many of those people who worked in industrial areas are now seen as sole traders, agent workers, if that's construction, or they own a hair salon, or they own a small business? The relation to capital is changing. How many of them have managed to get lines of credit on their small business that they can then buy houses to rent out to other people in order to get ahead? And where does that fit in the class strata, and how are they being politically represented, and what is their reaction or relation to forms of collective struggle in that tradition and that history, and how's that been warped very, very recently, very quickly? It's snowballed into, it's morphing into how they express themselves politically as well. So it's about not only remembering these traditions, but actually being able and nimble enough as a movement or as people who are on the left and do think of these things to be able to tell a coherent story of the last 10 years, and I mean the last 50 years, because I think that's where we are falling behind, is we're not able to understand it and tell a coherent story to then go out and articulate other things. I think any new political organisation or new vehicle is a number of questions to ask themselves before they start that ball rolling. And we've got to ask all ourselves that, regardless of what political parties or vehicles going forward, is like, where are we as a class? How do we define ourselves, and then how can we articulate a story that then builds a movement? 150 years ago, if you want, they'd done that, but it took 50 years for that movement to start rolling. We've not got another 50 years to do that.
Is it possible to tell a story which connects those people? Some people call it family capital, don't they? The people you're talking about with in the post-industrialised Central Belt and elsewhere. Is it possible, do you think, to tell a story which weaves those people into a narrative that also accommodates the downwardly mobile graduate in the service sector who's just left Glasgow University?
I think there is. If you're asking me to say it right now, I can't, but I think there is a way in which we need to explore that, because that is going to be, I think that what gets misconstrued as a culture war sometimes is actually the expression of wildly changing class dynamics, exactly how you described. So you'll have your middle class or graduates from a middle class background who are now economically working class at the minute due to their relation for housing or in their work, and you'll have people who grew up in working class households who are now have access or greater access to capital or greater debt through capital as well, and have their relation to capital. And in the middle of all that, there's and it's happening 50 years of economic change are happening in 5 or 6 or 10 since COVID, since the cost of living. It's rapidly changing, and the displacement of people as well, even internally in the country, is something that hasn't been really analysed either. So you're getting a lot of people from deindustrialised areas, and maybe it's always happened, are moving back into cities, but is it a certain demographic of those areas are moving back into cities, and you get people are moving out of cities into new build schemes and houses that are outside, and you've now got deindustrialised areas that are mad, expansive commuter towns. The Central Belt is almost one big commuter town now. And that's going to have a change in political representation and a change in political agency. And there's a lot within that. I think the key thing is within it, all those people are trying to find an economic and political agency and economies where there isn't, at the minute, strong trade union representation that maybe there once was. And I think that's a massive impact on what's going on at the minute.
Francis, this ties into something you said earlier on. You described the Greens as not working class radical. They had a pretty good election, 17 seats, first constituency wins in the south side of Glasgow and Edinburgh Central, as well as picking up a seat in every region for the first time, making them a national party in Ross Greer's words. What did you mean by not working class radical?
Okay, I think all the parties, I think none of the parties who've been elected to, well, since the SSP was elected, are committed to and prepared to have the fight for the redistribution of wealth. And that's what the answer is, isn't it? We're a really wealthy country, there's never been no wealth, and there's no political organisation or party that's committed to that. And that includes the Greens. And I think that's what, to back to the thing about working class communities are calling out for. Because public service has been stripped since the banking crisis. You know, they've been absolutely, they're skeletons of their former selves. And that feeds through on an individual basis or a family basis or your department in a public sector workplace. That's how you experience what's happened since the 2008 crash. And there's been nobody has had the ability to articulate that in a way that can connect to the language of working class people. And I don't think the Greens do that. Two things, I don't think they do that, and I also don't think that they are serious about redistribution of wealth. And I think that's what it's going to take if you're going to build a movement. And having said that, I think where the left is and where it's been for the past decade is you've got a kind of, I think the Greens are urban, professional, student. That's the way that I see them. I don't know where the environment actually. I think they're having an issue about where to position themselves after Polanski's pivot almost, which I think, you know, Zoran Mandami, what's happened in the US has had an impact on that. And much more, I remember looking at the leaflets actually for the council elections, and it was very little about the climate change and very much about cost of living issues. And I thought, well, that's clear where they're trying to pivot, but it's also how they're seen. I'd love to be surprised, right? But I don't think I'm going to be. And so they've got a limit. Now, I think from a point of view of the left, there is an organised left that looks like that, outside of the Greens, as well as linked to the Greens. And I think the challenge is that if you're going to build a sizeable left, but based on what? It has to be on redistribution of wealth. It has to be on taking over the resources of Scotland for the people who live here and really taking on the rich, the elite, the global corporations, but nobody's prepared to do that. And a working class grassroots community organisation with the trade unions probably thrown in somewhere. Now, how to do that is complicated because we speak two different languages and we're talking to two different audiences.
What do you mean when you say we speak two different languages?
Because I think I don't think any of the politicians speak working class language.
Does Thomas Kerr speak working class language?
No, I don't think he does actually. Maybe people in Shettleston think he does. I think he sounds working class. I think there's two things. In America, they did a working class research unit. I can't remember the full name. They were interested in why the division in the US was between those who have got a college degree and those who don't. And the right wing had the base amongst those who don't have a college degree, and the Democrats had the base amongst those who do, the better educated. And I think one of the things that they found is that working class people are actually and it was quite a really in-depth survey, they found that working class people were more progressive than a lot of the social issues than they're given credit for. But the candidates who spoke to them were candidates who talked about economic issues, their cost of living, job security, healthcare, minimum wage, all of those sorts of issues. And they didn't mind a candidate who maybe didn't sound like them, but they had to talk about those issues. But they did find that they wanted candidates who looked like them and who spoke like them. So I can understand that, and I think that is something. Nobody in that parliament, I don't know who in that parliament, would talk like the SSP MSPs back in 2003. But they also don't speak the language. There's a whole professional class that have got this language. People who run and control Scotland. And you know you're working class because you're this end of the table, and you're, even when I was in Parliament, I mean, I'm on the board of the college, and you're negotiating with them, and they deliberately obscure what they're trying to do. They don't straight talk, and you're in this side of the table saying, how many job losses is that? What are you doing about this? And they just make up this language to try and prevent you from getting a handle on the policies that they're going to put through. And that's fed into the politics. It's fed right into the politics. When I hear politicians on the telly, when I read the leaflets and the language that they use, I just think, what does this mean to anybody? But it's deliberate. It's not like it's an accident. It's deliberate professionalese. And I think that also grates the working class people. You know when you're being spoken into, you know you're being condescended to, you know when people think you're not educated enough. And in Scotland, 70% of the population don't have a university degree. Only it's actually 28% have. And yet, here's a challenge for us. When I'm sitting in left-wing meetings, everybody's been to uni. Now I went to uni when I was 45, right? And hands up. But do you know what I mean? You get my point, don't you? And so, what about the rest? I know you're talking about a stratification of the working class, right? And that's definitely the case. But see, when you get somebody who's articulate, look at Mick Lynch. He became the everyman for all sorts of frustrations and anger. And he opened the door, and he was articulate, and he was on the telly, and he was taking them on. And thousands of people went through that door. We had the meeting in the fruit market. You know, as soon as you've got that pull of attraction there, then people respond to it. But there's no politician in that parliament who can speak like that, you know. And I think that's one of the losses. It's a loss that the Scottish Socialist Party and the left, as we were then, actually could do that.
Yeah, I think I completely agree that Parliament has a distinct lack of working class voices, or a distinct lack of relatability and authenticity with working class people. It does increasingly seem like a very small bureaucratic bubble that is detached from the daily reality of a lot of Scottish people and people in Scotland. And I think that's where Reform drove a big massive wedge right in it. And they were the only ones to say that. They were rallying against a cosy consensus, which I think a lot of people on the left also agree with, but just didn't have the platform or weren't able to articulate in the same ways. And your points around, Francis, I think, university degrees and stuff, I think there is as someone who never went to university, like there is a bit of that. But I think it's becoming more and more caught up. People do realise that, but it's more, I think it is to do with the idea that they've been patronised. You know what I mean? People, of course, are not working with some of the city's lowest paid public sector workers. When you took them into a room with politicians or directors of the council, there was an instant class dynamic. It was, and it happened in a couple of ways. So the directors or the politicians would feel that they should not be spoken to in a certain way by these lowly people, and so they'd be condescending or patronising, or they felt, and if they didn't understand, if a bin man or a carer didn't understand what a terms of reference was or what's an agenda or how to raise an item on the agenda, it was sneered at almost explicitly. And then the other side of the table, highly articulate, highly intelligent people who are very good at their jobs, but also charismatic and have leadership qualities within their workplaces, are then going to these forums and being faced with this patronising, sneering attitude, and it'll get their back up straight away, as it would, because they know what's happening, they have to face it. But more often than not, they would win the argument. The working class people would win the argument due to the force of their argument, but also the righteousness of it, but also just being able to have an argument and how to structure an argument mentally without the need of papers and evidence and backup. And I think that's what Parliament's missing, is that it's become almost so technocratic, whereas the ability to just be able to construct an argument in your head the same way you'd have in the workplace on a night out on the playground, and be able to have that kind of verbal tradition of having the argument, having the debate, is gone. So part of what I think we need to miss is like reigniting some level of proper debating in a way that doesn't seem so safe and doesn't seem so technocratic. And have a bit of, I used to have a boss that said it, verbal ping pong, he called it, like, and that can get, that's what they can upset people, can upset the cause of consensus, and people will say things that maybe aren't great at times, but it's in the nature of learning and nature of developing. But I want to go back to the point around, are the Greens a working class party? Are they a middle class party? Or do they not? I think it's a tactical choice by them. So I think they do want to, or a lot of them will understand and want to redistribute wealth.
Do you really?
I think they do. And Francis, you and I had this similar conversation 10 years ago when it's the language that the left uses. And I think they're still in a position where the left shied away from using that language for whatever reason.
Redistribution.
The language of redistribution, the language of class, the language of capital, the language of ownership and balance of force. There's a rejection using that language to fit in or to corner a market of the electorate that is maybe scared of that or doesn't want to use that. I think they've been quite tactical in a way, saying, let's not scare liberal, left-leaning, nice people who maybe think they're middle class by using that language.
So are the Greens are doing that, or the left are doing that?
So I think they're in a position where the Greens have been quite tactical in not using that language to make sure they don't scare people away. And on the other side, you've got Reform who are deliberately using elements of certain language to bring people in. And that's a dichotomy I think will play out interestingly. Don't go wrong, I think there's elements of the Greens, they had a huge manifesto, right? And I don't know anyone who's managed to read it, apart from the wee guy at the National who said he'd read it all. You get paid to do it. But there's also good stuff in there, and it will directly benefit working class people, I'm sure. But the biggest thing for me is it's not quite clear to me, and it's not about just redistribution of wealth, it's about the ownership of industry, the ownership of wealth. A lot, it seems that, and this is where, if we do again into the reforms argument, is like you're asking the population to be taxed to then pay for these free things, as reform would say. But ultimately, unless it's owned by the state or collectively publicly owned, you're taxing people to then pay corporations. I don't think we can agree with that. So why should tax then be funneled up and out the economy through private enterprise? Whereas if you're going to tax people to pay for public services, they should be owned by the public and they should be publicly accountable. And that bit's maybe a technicality that I don't think is quite clear with the Greens. But I do think they're being quite clever and coy, avoiding talking about class, the environment position as well. I think they're being quite strategic and tactical and not want to run down environmental policies at a time when the public opinion is maybe waning on that due to the unjust transition and everything else that's going on. So they're talking about you can't have social justice without, or you can't have environmental justice without social justice. It's like the language is there, the policies are there. And I don't know. I suspect it's a tactical choice rather than overt. But the problem is we need to have that overt voice and opinions in those rooms, or it's more easy for it to slide.
I think there's two things I want to go into a bit. One is the point you just made about, I think Sean's right, and there is this commitment in the Greens to the redistribution of wealth, right, in the form of things like progressive taxation, which they talk about a lot, right? They talk about their success in the last Parliament raising income tax bands for higher earners. I think that's one thing. I think the redistribution of power is an entirely different question, which the Greens are fundamentally less interested in. And that's the distinction that I would make. And I think with regards to the redistribution of power, the record is much more questionable, and that's where things like Scotland in the last Parliament and this PFI deal honestly are signed, which we talk about a lot and maybe too much, but I think are important to remind people of. That's where they fall down, is on that question of where power should lie in the economy. But I do think there is a baseline commitment to a belief in a fairer distribution of wealth. But I think that's distinct from the conversation about power. The point I want to pick up on, and I think we're getting to the nub of it now, is this point about language again, right? And we're saying that it's important that we don't speak the working class language, right? But at the same time, we're saying that the working class is more diverse now in its cultural representation and in its background. So I guess the question is, if we are saying that elements of the people who the left should be speaking to include those who have that university degree but who are now overwhelmingly employed in precarious jobs in the service sector but have the cultural trappings of a professional experience at Glasgow University, right? What is a language then that bridges that divide? Because you're right, that's the contradiction, isn't it? Right? How do you speak a language that talks to what we conceive culturally as the blue collar working class, and then the downwardly mobile student from middle class background who's now working in the pub?
I don't think there is a huge contradiction there.
Yeah, absolutely.
No.
I think, firstly, redistribution of power, I'm stealing it, I like it. Let's coin that phrase here first. In terms of the relation to the Greens. But certainly that, I think we're in danger even in this conversation of patronising working class people and what their language is, right? And what relates to what they understand. People understand a hell of a lot more than you give them credit for, of course they do. And I think the problem comes where it's not the language, it's just like maybe even cultural expressions.
Yeah.
It can be different between people with different backgrounds, economic backgrounds. And I think it highlights how stratified our class has been when there's no relationships between people. Like, people can go through their full life still and not build relationships with people with slightly different backgrounds. In terms of what housing estate did you grow up in? What scheme did you grow up in? What mode of transport did you get into work? The workplaces you work in, for so long, sectors have been divided by different stratas of that working class, middle class strata. I think at the minute we're just in a huge period of flux where people are getting tossed and turned and thrown about all over the place. The language of solidarity will be the one that unites those two groups, and it will come through working shoulder to shoulder in workplaces more than anything else, and facing the same challenges through daily life, also the same challenges around housing, your work, transport, cost of living. These are the language of solidarity around these issues will unite people, and it's been proven to, and will keep people going forward. I think what's happened is sections of the left, when they go into spaces that are different, have become paternalistic around over working class people, or people who represent or present themselves as middle class, if that's the right way of saying that, have become paternalistic on the left over people who present themselves as working class. There's this othering of working class people that's always really upset and annoyed me. This othering of we are really good, nice left-wing people doing these really nice things for these poor, disadvantaged working class people. That needs to stop. And in stopping that and actually having people from different backgrounds, different cultures, working together in their own collective self-interest is what's going to move that forward. And people understanding that, and not this go to different spaces and respecting this. It divides people a bit more. Whereas you say, right, what's the common collective interest in the room, right? So you are fighting that because for yourself and your own interest, but also it aligns with others' self-interest. So if we have a collective interest, how do we move forward with that struggle? And I think that's what will unite people. And if we do it in a very honest and open way, people will build relationships and will cut through this. We've seen it in all the different things we've all been involved in. It's just that we've not shouted about it enough.
But see, I just think the thing about language. Poor. Actual language and the slant of language if I can illustrate it, I've been involved in the last few weeks in talking to some younger people on the left about what we stand for, right? And drafting something to explain why you should get involved in sort of left-wing politics. And it's along the lines of, the opening lines are, we're anti-war, we're anti-colonialism, we're anti-racist, we're this, we're that, we're the other. And it's all this global stuff, and you're just like, well, yeah, of course, man, been marching for years on that. But who are you talking to? If that is the statement that you want to put it, and it's general, and it's big picture. By the way, I love a big picture, so big picture politics. But such lack of self-awareness if you're going to build a left-wing organisation about the type of language that you need to use. And that doesn't mean to say that you can't talk about changing the world, humanity, aspiration, everybody being allowed the enough income and house and making sure they've got a good life so that they can explore their talents and all that. I mean, there was a huge working class culture to that extent when I joined the movement in the 80s, when about 74. I went to see Lee Jeans play, by the way, and it was Stand and Deliver, and it was fantastic. And the women were so articulate, and it was their words that the playwright used. So it's not about being patronising, and it's not about the whole Labour movement's got the idea that we can transform ourselves and transform our lives and, bread and roses, explore culture and music and art and all of that. That's not what it's about. But there's an entrenched language here that doesn't speak to people. And it's not easy, right? Because you have to find both. You have to find the bread and you have to find the roses. And you have to find it in the particular historical time that you live in. But I think that's more than possible. I think that's what people like Mick Lynch did. Other people who've spoken like that, people respond to it. That's the point. And the other thing is about working class people, it really annoys the hell out of me. The assumption is if you live in a scheme now, then you're really working class. We all grew up in schemes, and everybody worked. And it's still the case in housing association and different schemes. People work. The idea that the working class isn't represented in those schemes might be on minimum wage. And it's a kind of, if you don't buy your own home or you don't live in this better area, that these are sometimes, left behind places. It's not true. And also, people who've moved out, bought their house, moved into the commuter towns, 70% of the population in Scotland, either by identification or by socioeconomic designation, consider themselves working class. They buy into that history of Scotland. And I'm not sure the current left are connecting with that in that way, like the Lee Jeans stuff, which it was younger people in the audience. And no, it's nostalgia, right? Those factories probably don't, the type of factory is nostalgia, but the sentiments that were expressed in it and that solidarity. And it's like solidarity, because, like we both know, we were in strike in my college for 9 months. And lecturers are no badly paid. So it wasn't about wearing the bones of our arse, right? It was about the principle of job losses and cuts and what was happening in the public sector and management and what they thought they could do. And we held that solidarity for that amount of time. So I think that response could happen all over communities and workplaces across the whole of Scotland. Do you know what's missing though? And I don't leadership for that type of struggle. And I don't know the simple answer to that, by the way.
I want to come on to the question of leadership and organisation in a second. I want to touch on something Sean said and tease that out first, and that's place. You're talking about commuter towns, talking about the changing political character of the post-industrial central belt. Have we lost the politics of place that we had during the latter half of the 20th century?
Yeah, and it ties almost completely back into the whole point of this discussion was around how do you define and articulate ourselves as a class. But also the point I made at the start of this evening was that with no storyteller, we're not telling a story about that. So the reason why you're saying there's no identity, there's a loss of identity, is that working class people have not been given the platform or afforded the position to tell the story of that beyond decline.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be because it's quite relative. Like, these economic changes or demographics have changed quite recently, that there's not been that time for that story to emerge or be articulated or promoted afterwards. But there is stories to tell, and there's new identities that will be created. So the thing about culture, identity, place, which again is something that Reform's pushing heavily, is that the loss of that. But these things always evolve and always change, and the working class people within them always evolve and change over time. And it's almost also the economic security of working class people to be able to articulate their own story and promote and tell their own stories, whether it's writing through music, film now, or podcasts or whatever. It's the resource and the time and the economic stability to be able to do that. But we are seeing those changes. The young guys in the band that put it Mayday, look, their songs are growing up about growing up in the post-industrial Falkirk.
Yeah.
And it's amazing songwriting, and they're doing it in a way that is very Scottish and it's very unique, and it's relatable. I imagine it's relatable to me, as I'm maybe a generation older now, but I'm a bit jealous. I wish I was in that band at the time. But so these stories are starting to emerge, and there's different books that are being written now that are starting to tell and etch out that 21st century post-industrial Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also, like, the problem is that you go all the way back to the start and you say, right, these industrialised places, they became industrialised, and the people were displaced from elsewhere to there. It was people from all across the world, different times, were displaced from somewhere to these industrial places for industry, for an economic reason to be there. Institutions, organisations of economic self-defence were built up around them, as were housing, public infrastructure. A lot of this stuff had to be fought and won for by the people that were moved there. And from that, the political leadership that Francis discussed, but the political education was drafted and learned through that process of struggle because of an economic purpose. So the politics of place isn't maybe not the politics of place, it's the politics of economic purpose. Mm. So what is the economic purpose of these places? Yeah. Now they are changing. It is to feed increasingly urban areas. But the one thing I will say, if see Francis what I can, but the one thing I will say is the best way I've been thinking about this, the best way I've seen it described actually is like when we look at the Italian city-states, and each one's got its own football team, but each city-state...
But yes, yeah, but that was my question.
Yeah, so each city-state has its own cultural or economic... It's its own cultural identity, but a lot of time it's tied to its economic purpose of that state, or that city-state. And there's a great episode, one of the Copenhagen series, where it's talking about Brescia and Atalanta. And they are two, that's your Lanarkshires of Glasgow, I think, right? These peri-urban places outside Milan, the industrial city of Milan. And it said, like, Brescia and Atalanta, or Bergamo, that's where the tradespeople stay. But they'll work in Milan, but they stay in these areas, and they've got areas where they've got, it's not a steel town, or it's not a mill town, or it's not they are a specific trade all comes from these areas and these towns. And I quite like the idea of that. And it's not that Scotland doesn't have these things now, because since the industrialisation, skills, we've all built skill shortage, and working class kids need to go out and get apprenticeships, or we need to go and do this. Skills have changed to suit the economy. We've just not been able to tell that story. So what is the story of people that stay in all these towns that are maybe get a stronger reform foothold? What is their economic story? What is their economic purpose? And then what's their cultural expression? Not just their political expression and representation, but what's the cultural expression that goes out of these places? And do we as a country, or as a nation, or as a state, afford to enough time for people to express that and be able to develop it in a place that then your political education could develop through that as well also?
But see, the thing about working class culture, it's football. Let's get to another role.
Please
Do you know what I mean? The role that the club plays, and it's no one in the big cities, right? You could be considering that one of these sort of left behind towns in that way. You've got Motherwell, you've got Usher, you've got, I don't know, Craigneuf, that place. Anyway, I know it is. But do you know what I mean? What role does that play if you look across Scotland? Also, what are you talking about, these dormitory towns? I mean, most of the... Wait, I don't understand. Are you talking about Cumbernauld, East Kilbride? Are you talking about other places that are along the M8 that have just sprung up with new houses at this point in time? What are we?
So
Do you not know?
Cumbernauld East Kilbride, you know, better than me, they were ancestral economic development, they were overspill from Glasgow.
Yeah, they've got
So
clear identities, and they know,
But
people of 3 generations living there now.
yeah, but they were once the overspill of
Uh-huh.
inner city
Yeah.
Glaswegians that then had to
Yeah.
move out because
Yeah.
of economic changes within the city at that time.
You want it back front door. Yes.
That was a big one, yeah. But also they had changing the industry, but also
Uh-huh.
overcrowding, housing issues.
Yeah.
And the solution was to build these
Uh-huh.
big towns, essentially, and the design and creation and the political and economic afterthought of that. But also East Kilbride and Cumberland had huge industrial estates that largely
Yeah,
aren't
that's true.
nearly
Yeah.
as much anymore either. So that you built workplaces around them and you gave international subsidies to international companies to go and build stuff up there that maybe doesn't exist in the same way. So there's elements of that as well. But you still have Cumbernauld, you still would still see East Kilbride, you still have the Lanarkshires, Motherwell, but you sort of hops along the M8 in a way, and then you've got Falkirk and other deindustrialised areas. That's where it's more on the side of the Forth. But if you go 20 miles either side of the M8, it's still rural mining villages.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
absolutely.
So how are they being redefined and what is their economic purpose now? So I think a lot of mining villages
But they're going to have an identity. What I'm trying to understand is these. So are you not imagining, but is it happening that these dormitory, developments, right, where people are all moving out to buy a house there for whatever reasons, and they're all coming from different places and having to create a new identity in that way? I suppose my question is, and I don't know the answer to this, but how much is that the case compared to the old mining towns in Ayrshire? The Falkirks, the Kirkcaldy, the Coatbridges, the Chapel Halls, the what's it called, Whitburns. They're expanding out, but they've still got this kind of identity. There's still a population there that's lived there for a long period of time, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a new population that's moved in.
But are they hegemonic in that area though? So as part of the change in these areas is that you've got your small nucleus of third, fourth generation ex-mining families whose job and relation has changed and they will still stay in these communities?
Yeah.
Or is there an emerging class conflict in a way of these new estates that are popping up on the outskirts and almost engulfing old mining villages that had an identity? People are coming in from elsewhere, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing or people shouldn't go in, but people are displaced because maybe it's cheaper housing and it's easier to commute, and you can get a back to the front door now, and you can get a nice wee picket fence and a hedgerow, and there's a train station, there's maybe a nice wee pub, but the character of these villages are changing, and is that leading to feelings of alienation for some people? But also on the other hand, is it you've got no one can know how that's going to play out, but you've got people from different back in different places all descending and they'll be forced to create new cultural identities and new expressions. And I don't think part of the thing that nobody knows is because we don't think we have these conversations enough. These conversations might happen somewhere and they might be expressed in ways we disagree with in certain places, but they're not happening enough. The characters, I think, this city's changed in 10 years. I don't think it's a bad thing. But for some people, they'll have sensed that. So you're saying it's a visceral sense of decline. But also there's a visceral sense that characters changed in certain areas or how it's been expressed. Glasgow's cultural expression's changed in the last 10 years. Well, for a lot of people, they will perceive that and they'll feel it and they'll understand it, but they might express it in ways that you and I disagree with it, and it's never been drawn out or it's never been openly discussed or it's never been analysed in a way that then can give some political coherency to it. And I think that should be the role of the left or the socialist left or the working class left as much as anybody else. Because if we don't do it, you are going to get people like Offord and Thomas Kerr and Nigel Farage who will come up and put in our door and stand in places like Falkirk and talk our story about our class, about deindustrialisation and how they're being left behind by a political elite with no other answer. I think part of the deindustrialisation one is that people on the left became unfashionable to talk about it, so we just stopped. We can't just so we can't just stop talking about it.
Yeah.
We can't stop talking about the impacts of it. But the problem is, I don't know if we ran out of answers or we've ran out. But we've not been able to, we need to pick that story up again. And it's the discussions we've just had and start to tell a new story about where we've gone from since deindustrialisation, but where do we want to go next and what that will look like. Because we've not discussed today, but the election spoke nothing around the AI bubble busting, the unjust transition, public sector reform, the growing need for tax reform that will come,
Yes.
the multifaceted layer of challenges to working class communities will affect them the most. And none of that's getting discussed in this election. It's not going to be discussed in this parliament when you've got a polarised, second and third place party just wanting to strips off each other. You know what I mean? When the SNP are quite happy to hold that centre ground, keeps them all in a job. You know what I mean?
No, I agree with you. I don't
So-
think any of those questions, because class questions are not addressed in the
No,
Parliament.
and I think that's the thing with all about redistribution of power, Call, is actually why I think you do need explicitly class-based representation in Parliament to drive through some of that and hold some politicians of different traditions to account on a
It's also
class
going to make
perspective.
politics though, because it's a career now. Right?
Yeah.
It's a career, and it's where the idea of a workers' MP and an MSP and a workers' wage comes in, because that is an indication that you're not there to climb the ladder, that you're there to actually represent working class people, because you're living in the same wages. You're living. I mean, you live in the area that you're representing. You understand the issues that they're facing, and I think it's an idea that seems to have gone out of fashion a bit. I think we need to bring it back. If you want to go to Parliament and represent working class people in working class areas, then it's not a career step. You actually, the traditions of Glasgow, there's a sacrifice to be involved, or you're not going to get, you're not going to lay down a nice professional career path for yourself, and you'll be expected to fight as well on those issues, you know?
We haven't got enough time to go into this properly, but devolution's a big part of that story, right? In the sense that devolution is the means by which the Scottish political class, Scottish professional political class expands massively, because it creates a whole layer of governance which requires a whole raft of satellite institutions around it. The Times, of all people, did an analysis of candidates standing in last Thursday's election a few months before polling day. 98% of SNP candidates were classed as political professionals. 98%. 66% of Green candidates classed as political professionals. 67% of Labour candidates. The figure for Reform was 25%, unsurprisingly, I suppose. I want to wrap up on that very question of what next for the left. That's a big question to finish up on. But you have mentioned some of the fights coming down the track, be it the AI bubble, the unjust transition, the 20,000 job cuts that we are likely to see, or public sector efficiencies, as the SNP call them. Again, Francis' point about political language is important here, because that's dressed up as public service reform. What do you see, Francis, as the prospects for the left in the coming period, given this election result? Talked about working class representation. Is it the case that after a pretty poor set of election results for the smaller left wing parties, that question still needs to be answered about working class representation in Scotland, and the need for an organisation to generate that?
I think there's been a need for a new party in the left for about 2 decades since SSP came apart, and that was a defeat, and I think that's one of the reasons we're in this situation. I think the other issue is for those who are active in the left, and I think that's tens of thousands of people in Scotland, by the way. What are you putting forward? What's transformative about the ideas that you're putting forward? This thing about redistribution of wealth. I've got different ideas about the council tax, about reforming taxation, about taxing land, taxing buildings, challenging the idea that you can just come in here, buy up a big load of land and you don't pay a penny and it's held in the Cayman Islands, that type of approach. And how you release money, or how you raise money from that in order to replenish public services. I think there's a lot of ideas in the mix at the moment, and you're going to need a kind of manifesto like that. But just putting that into the public discourse without something else behind it that you're going to fight for it, I think doesn't necessarily resonate. I think it's probably going to come through struggle. And what we've noticed, I know AI is longer term, but maybe not that longer term. But the impact of the war in Iran is about to hit. I mean, give it 6 months, give it 9 months. It's hard for anybody to even suggest, and we're talking about, capitalist economists to actually say what the impact of this is going to be. And given that Britain's Brexited, it's less protected, and then Scotland, in relation to that doesn't have control over its own finances or her own finances and her own power, then it's going to have an even greater impact there. And I think probably the advancement of the left and the confronting of some of these issues is going to come through some of that. I mean, we saw it with the Power of the People campaign when it looked like energy bills were going to go up 80%. There was a real mood for a non-payment campaign, but Rishi Sunak made a concession and ended up paying for it. We paid for it, and the Scottish Power and the energy companies made off to the bank. But I think that type of thing is going to be repeated, and I think it'll be. I think it's interesting. The SNP, I said there's no policies that any of them have put forward. And my closest tunnel getting painted is definitely getting painted now. But the thing about capping food prices is actually quite a challenge to global corporations getting their own way. And it's an indication of the pressure that they're under. Now, I'd like to see them try it. And it would be good if they did try it. I think they'll back away from it because for a whole load of reasons. But if you can't bread and you can't milk and you cap a few other things, well, you've won the principle of it, haven't you? Westminster will fight it tooth and nail. Why not go further? And then you're beginning to get that challenge. And even if they don't implement it, you could see a big movement coming behind that and doing something radical in Tesco's and Morrison's and everywhere else. So I think maybe that's the way that we're going to begin to see the rebirth of an active movement on the left. But I do think there's a political discussion to be had, and I think we need to talk to each other in a very open way, all take some responsibility for the situation that we're in, and with good grace try and move forward to come together in some sort of organised form, because if we don't, then our class is going to be battered once again.
Yeah, I think, for instance, you mentioned earlier discussions you were having with young activists, and it was very big pictures, very big ideas. I think we do need to combat and address them as a class. I think we do it is to go back to my point around doing it through a collective self-interest. So you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, so what impact is the war having? So we're against war, so what impact is the war having on our lives? We're anti-racist. What impact does racism have on our lives? It defeats us, our unity and our class power. What impact does the scarcity of food, housing, energy have on us? We do want to tackle all these big things, but we're tackling them through a position of collective self-interest, and that's why working class people, or the working class, is so important to identify and define ourselves as that, but also be able to articulate and organise ourselves as that. I think you're right that we do need to come together and have those questions. I think as a movement, if we want to call ourselves that, we need to come and discuss some basic ideas almost, or answer basic questions together. Like, what is it we're trying to build? What is it we're trying to who is it we're trying to represent? Why do we want to say we want representing those people? Do we have a mandate to represent those people? What we're going to do with that mandate if we're able to do it, and why do we want to do that? Like, there's these basic questions, but at the minute, like, goes back to the development or the splits that came off the SSP was a defeat. And I think you're right, because I think the different traditions that built up the SSP at its peak all complemented each other in different ways. The different traditions on the socialist left, and I think having them in one place was hugely beneficial, and having that fragmentation has been difficult. Different traditions naturally develop different leaders in different places, and I think what's happened is it's fragmented, but it's pulling your organic leaders from the class that emerge through struggle in different directions, but it's also doing it in a way that alienates them from their base, that alienates them from the rest of their class. And I think the left has become alienated from its base, from its class. So regardless of the formations or different things, if you've now got what on the left would be called vanguard parties, what van are they guarding? At the minute, we don't have a van to guard, and for me, it's about building that van again in some ways. And then if you want to have a discussion about vanguardism, we can try and guard it, or we can join it, but we need to have a mandate to be able to do that. So we need to go back and answer all these questions again, and it might seem quite archaic for some people, but I think actually it's where we're at on the development of organisations in the Scottish left. We need to go back and discuss it, because for me, there's little point in trying to replicate what the Greens are doing in certain ways, just electoral and policy, and then just try to be a bit more working class about it. Like, for me, it's a bit like, see what do it. The Greens are there, let them do it.
Yeah.
Let's have another pull of attraction, or another base of power that can peg them to a way of thinking or push the dynamic that way, but which also builds up and redistributes that power for working class people.
See, just on that, well done, Sean. That was a good ending. But I went to say, for people who don't know, because it's like 2 decades ago, but the SSP didn't come from nowhere. It was built on struggle. So Scottish Militant Labour led the anti-protest campaign. 1 million people break the law. I mean, it's phenomenal, and it's been forgotten about, actually. There's lots of lessons there, and it was built on working class communities. But what actually created the Scottish Socialist Party, or that is forerunner of the Scottish Socialist Alliance, was the Criminal Justice Act. And what the Criminal Justice Act did is it brought together a whole load of people who would never have been in a room together. So it had all the young guys for the schemes. It had people who'd been involved in that protest campaign and been lefties forever. It had the motorway protesters. It had the hunt saboteurs. It had the left of the Labour Party. It had the Communist Party. It had all the Desert Storm ravers. I mean, it was just mad. But there was a fund of goodwill to come together to say, we're all being attacked and we need to find a way to bring this together. And that's how it started. Now, if you'd asked me in advance, is that how a new part of the left's going to no, who are these people in the clown trousers? But never mind, you know what I mean? And juggling and all like that. Have we got a lot in common? Yes, we have, it turned out. And it was the same, you know, with the motorway protesters up a tree and all that, and abseiling, you're like that, okay. And they were probably looking at us thinking the same thing. But there was a fund of goodwill and a joint understanding of what we were up against and what we needed to create. And I think that tolerance and fund of goodwill has been missing on the left for a long period of time now. And I think that is the culture with which we need to get together and learn from each other as well and be tolerant about it.
I think that's a very good note to end on. We've been talking about the history of the SSP, and probably something that is useful to tease out properly in a longer form interview. We might have you back on, Francis, to do that. But thanks very much to you both for coming on. I think that's been a good and useful conversation. Thanks to you for listening at home. As ever, Scotia is supported by people like you on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint a month. So if you've got any spare cash going, we'd appreciate it. With that said, thanks again. We'll see you soon.